Hello everyone. Welcome to IGNOU's Master's Program in Journalism and Mass Communication. My name is Lizzie Vincent and I will be dealing with the first course NJM 020 Introduction to Journalism and Mass Communication in this session. Today we will be discussing about the Block 1 Unit 1 Communication Concepts and Processes. Let's begin the lesson. What is communication? Communication is perhaps one of the most loosely defined terms in contemporary media and cultural studies. It is perhaps because the term encompasses a multitude of experience, actions and events, as well as a whole variety of happenings and meanings and technologies. Thus, a conference or a meeting or even a festival is a communication event. Newspapers, radio, video and television are communication media. Phones, computers, satellites and the internet are the communication technologies. And the journalists, advertisers, public relation personnel and even the entire crew that works for a film industry and newsreaders are communication professionals. The English word communication is derived from the Latin noun communis and the Latin verb communicare, which means to make common. The terms closely related to communication and with similar etymological origins include community, communion, commonalty, communalism, and communism. Communication, in its simplest sense, then is a human relationship involving two or more people who come together to share, to dialogue, and to commune, or just to be together, say at a festival or just a friends gathering together to spend some time. Communication is thus not so much an act or even a process, but rather social and cultural togetherness. Interaction, interchange, transaction, dialogue, sharing, communion, and commonness are ideas that crop up in any attempt to define the term communication. According to Dennis McQuail, communication is a process which increases commonality but also requires elements of commonality for it to occur at all. A common language, for instance, does bring people together, but language alone does not suffice for communication to take place. There are other factors too at play, such as a shared culture and a common interest, which bring about a sense of commonality and, more significantly, a sense of community. Communication is as necessary to human, animal, and vegetable existence as life itself. Halt communication and the life processes wither and die. The need for communication is as basic as the hunger for food and drink, perhaps even more so. It is both an individual and a social need. It is both a natural individual demand and a requirement of social existence to use communication resources in order to engage in the sharing of experiences through symbol mediated interactions. The severest punishment for anyone is to be isolated, to be left alone, not to be spoken to. Society punishes criminals by locking them up in solitary cells, thus starving them of the basic need and indeed the fundamental right to communicate. Communication involves active interaction with our environments, physical, biological, and social environments. Deprived of this interaction, we would not be aware of whether we are safe or in danger, whether hated or loved, or satisfied or hungry. However, most of us take this interaction and this relationship for granted unless we experience some kind of deprivation of it. So, the basic foundation of human society is communication. And this communication, this interaction, it takes place at different levels. It can be with oneself, between individuals, between individual and a group, between groups, between countries, and so on and so forth. Similarly, we use verbal and non-verbal forms of messages for communication. Communication is very essential for the development of the society. We attain cultural, social, and economic prosperity by sharing our experiences. We can't imagine a world without media. The basic mission of mass media is to create ties in human society, sharing the news and information among themselves. In modern world, media have some more roles to play. Media defines our political system, form our public opinion, support public demands, and set agenda of our social life. In short, no social activity, be it be marketing, business, education, politics, media profession, is possible without communication. Communication can be defined as a process concerning exchange of facts or ideas. Communication process must be considered as a continuous and dynamic interaction, both affecting and being affected by many variables that we call as elements. There are a few elements of communication that gives us more insight in the process of communication. Let's discuss each element. The center is the idea generating component in the communication process. In human communication, center may be a person or persons who create or formulate the message to be sent to the receiver. Be the primary source of a message, center is also termed as a source. Center is a critical component in communication as the center's social background, personality status, education, etc. influence the quality of the message he or she creates. The message is created from the idea generated in the mind of the center. The idea generation process is called encoding. The source or the center has three functions: to decide what is to be communicated, encoding, that is putting the idea in such a way that the receiver understands it, and transmitting the message to the receiver. The next element of process of communication is the message. It is any verbal or non-verbal method that produces meaning in the mind of the receiver. Simply, it is a meaning transfer from the center's mind to the receiver's mind. This happens mainly in two ways: verbal and non-verbal methods. Verbal messages means written or oral messages. They are composed of words. Whereas non-verbal messages are those communicated through our behavior, movements, actions, clothes, style of conversation, pitch of the sound, etc. What is fundamental in message construction is the agreement between the center and the receiver in the code used for it. If the receiver cannot identify the language or meaning of the message, the communication will be defective. The next element of communication is the channel. It means the medium by which the sender transmits the message to the receiver. Our five senses, such as hearing, touching, smelling, tasting, seeing, are basic natural channels of human communication. Communication can be classified on the basis of five basic natural channels. They are tactile communication, that is communication by touch or taste; olfactory communication, communication by smell; audio communication, communication through sound waves; and visual communication, communication through visual elements or properties. We use any technically developed medium with the help of one or more of these five senses. Similarly, centers use one or more channels to maximize the communication effect. The next element of communication is receiver. The idea receiving end in the communication process is called the receiver. A person or thing may be at the receiving end. The receiver's role is as important as the center's role, and as in the case of the center, receiver has also three roles to play. 1. To receive the message, 2. To decode the message, and 3. To respond to the message through feedback. This decoding is the process of extracting a message from a code and interpreting it. For this, the sender and the receiver should have knowledge about the code, for example, the language that they are communicating in. The receiver may be audiences watching the movies, people listening to music, students hearing a lecture, or a computer getting an email from a remote server. Communication fails or remains faulty when message is rejected or misinterpreted by the receiver. For effective communication, it produces a desired feedback. Information or message that is fed back to the source is called feedback. If you get appreciation for a song that you just sang, that appreciation is the feedback. Questions raised by students in the classroom for more information is another example of feedback. Feedback can originate either from the source's own messages, and this type of feedback is called self-feedback. For example, when you talk to somebody, you hear yourself and evaluate your tone, pitch, etc. And you might think that you could have sharpened or softened your tone or pitch or the text. And this kind of analysis is called self-feedback. Another type of feedback that is originated from the receiver's end. It may be in the form of questions, applauses, puzzled or confused looks. Feedback can be negative or positive, immediate or delayed. When the receiver's indication to the sender that the message was not received well, it is called negative feedback. Like, for example, there are looks of indifference in the face of the receiver, or rejection or boredom may be considered as negative feedback. Whereas positive feedback are the favorable responses from the receiver's end, like acceptance, applauses, etc. Feedback at the time of the communication itself or immediately just after it, after the communication process is over, is called immediate feedback. Example, the applauses a singer gets during the performance. Receiver's response when it is relatively much later than after the communication process is over is called delayed feedback. Like, for example, letters to the editor. There are, as I said before, for a communication to be effective, it should reproduce the desired feedback. But sometimes, even though the idea was communicated perfectly to the receiver, the message was constructed perfectly to the receiver, but still there was some kind of misinterpretation or miscommunication happening. This miscommunication happened because of some kind of barrier to communication. And in communication terminology, we term this barrier as noise. Okay, noise or communication barrier is anything that distorts a message. Noise may originate in any of the components of communication like source, message, channel, receiver, context, etc. And this noise is present when there is a difference between the message sent and the message that is received. Communication is not possible without noise, but its effect can be reduced through various methods such as using good grammar, clear voice, simple language, quality signals, etc. There are many classification to these barriers of communication. We can classify it into language barriers, psychological barriers, physical barriers, or physiological barriers, or mechanical barriers. So in the physical barriers, any kind of physical hindrance is termed as physical barriers. So we can divide physical barriers into four different types: the competing stimulus, environmental stress, subjective stress, and ignorance of the medium. Competing stimulus is in the form of another conversation going on within the hearing distance, or loud music or traffic noise in the background when the communication process is going on. Environmental stress can be any kind of stress in the environment, like for example a high temperature and humidity, poor ventilation, vibrations felt, a glare from a light source, all can contribute to distortions in the sending and receiving of the message. Subjective stress talks about the stress that is affected on an individual. Like for example, if the receiver is sleepy or is not keeping well, like ill health, or if the person has some kind of effect of a drug, or the mood is different, it all gives rise to a forms of subjective stress that often leads to great difficulty in listening and interpretation. And the last type of physical barriers is ignorance of the medium. The various media of communication in business are oral, written, audiovisual, or audio and visual. The use of a medium with which the communicators are not familiar would turn the medium itself into a barrier. So you have to understand the basic knowledge level of both the receiver as well as a sender, and construct a message using a medium that is understandable and that is usable for both the parties. The next type of barrier is our psychological barriers, and in that we will be discussing frames of differences, self-image, resistance to change, and defensiveness and fear. Each of us has certain frames of references by which we look at our world and people and the events and situations around us. So a frame of reference is a system of standards and values, usually implicit, underlying, and to some extent controlling an action or the expression of any beliefs, attitudes, or ideas. No two individuals possess exactly similar frames of references. To a large extent, our frames of references are influenced by our experiences, especially our childhood experiences, and the cultural environment we have grown up in. Learning and deeper experiences modify these mental sets as we grow and mature and develop diverse frames of references to meet different needs. We have reference groups whose attitudes towards religion, politics, education, and so on are adopted by us without being fully aware that we are doing so. Tied up with the term frame of reference is the term self-image or self-concept. It is a way an individual looks at himself or the picture he has of himself. It is this self-image that makes us always defend our point of view, to interpret message in the way we wish to interpret them, and to see reality according to our own preconceived notions. Thus, we tend to listen attentively to and interpret favorably those messages which gives a boost to our self-image, and reject or misinterpret messages which threaten that same image. The consequence is communications selectively. It is not only with regard to sending and receiving of messages that we are selective, but also in the extent we remember them. The risk of being changed is one of the most frightening prospects many of us can face. No wonder we resist change in any form with our might, except where we are convinced it is for our benefit. So new ideas that do not support our own views are resisted outright. In fact, most of the time we do not actually hear views which conflict with our own, but we hear with rapt attention any communication that reinforces our beliefs and our self-image. Closely related to the barrier raised by our resistance to change is the barrier of defensiveness. One of the man's most compelling need is to justify himself. Even when we are convinced we are wrong, few of us admit it as it means a loss of face. More often than not, therefore, we tend to rationalize the mistakes we made and the attitudes and opinions we hold so very dear. Fear is an effect of great potency in determining what the individual will perceive, think, and do. Indeed, together with the allied emotions of nervousness, anxiety, and tension, fear is the most constricting of all the effects, resulting in a tunnel vision. During an interview, a candidate's fear, tension, and anxiety tells on his performance. He fumbles for words, misinterprets questions, and in general gives a poor show of himself. Next is the linguistics and cultural barriers. As language is expression of the thoughts and experience of people in terms of their cultural environment. When the same language is made use of in a different culture, it takes on another color, another meaning. For instance, English is employed in India. It comes under the influence not only of the accent of the local language, but also the meanings and the connotations of words, phrases, and idioms of that language and of the culture that has given rise to it. Each language shapes the reasoning of its speakers. Thus, English enforces either or thinking and reasoning, which Chinese does not. Indeed, no human is free to describe nature with strict objectivity. He is a prisoner of his language, and even the same language has to cross not only cultural and generational gaps but political and social gaps as well. Language facilitates understanding, but there are times when it can be a barrier to communication. In the first place, a language, whether verbal or non-verbal, is ambiguous by nature. The words of language, for instance, are mere symbols and by themselves rarely represent only one meaning. Further, these symbols are understood differently by participants in communication, and words possess objective and subjective meaning. While objective meaning points to objects, people, and events, subjective meaning points to emotional and evaluational responses. The favorable and unfavorable association of a word depend upon the cultural context in which it is used. Meaning therefore exists not in the word themselves but in the minds of the people who uses them. Even simple words like love, freedom, happiness, and tragedy carry numerous associations depending upon the political and cultural situations people find themselves a part of. Another type of barrier is the vocabulary that is used, as well as the semantics that is used in the construction of the message. English language has a very extensive vocabulary which when not used judiciously can result in a miscommunication. Likewise, any kind of grammatical error in the communication process can lead to misinterpretation of the message. The last one are the mechanical barriers, are those barriers raised by the channels employed for interpersonal, group, or mass communication. Channels becomes barriers when the message is interfered with by some kind of disturbance, which increases difficulty in the reception or prevents some elements of message reaching its destination, or sometimes both. The absence of communication facilitates two would be a mechanical barrier. Technically, such barriers are clubbed together under the general term channel noise. This type of barrier includes any disturbance which interferes with the fidelity of the physical transmission of the message. A telephone that is in poor working order, making demands on the yelling ability of the sender and receiver, is a mechanical barrier in interpersonal communication. So also is cross-talk, often heard over an intercom link in an office or during long-distance calls. Thus, hearing is the physical act of receiving sound waves, a natural process. Listening, however, is a skill that has to be learned and developed, requiring hard work and practice. And for an effective communication, you have to be a good listener. In group communication, a rundown or a whistling microphone and the wrong placement of loudspeakers are disturbances which are mechanical in nature. In mass communication, mechanical barriers would include such disturbance as static on the radio, smeared ink in a newspaper, a rolling screen on television, a barely readable point size, or a film projector or a video that does not function perfectly. Types of communication. Communication has been classified into several types in terms of verbal and non-verbal, the technological and non-technological, the mediated and the non-mediated, the participatory and the non-participatory, and so on. One common typology relates to the size of a social group or the number of people involved in the experience of the communication. Such a typology ranges from the interpersonal and the intrapersonal and the transpersonal to the group and the mass. Intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication is individual reflection, contemplation, and meditation. Transcendental meditation, for instance, is an example of such communication. Conversing with the divine, with spirits and ancestors may be termed as transpersonal communication. This is a vital experience in the religious and monastic life and in ashrams and places of prayer. Interpersonal communication or face-to-face communication is direct face-to-face communication between two persons. It is, in other words, a dialogue or a conversation without the intervention of another person or a machine like the telephone or a two-way radio or television set. It is personal, direct, and intimate, allowing for maximum interaction and exchange in words and gestures. Indeed, it is the highest, the most perfect form of communication that two people can attain. It is more persuasive and influential than any other type of communication, such as group communication or mass communication, for it involves the interplay of words and gestures, the warmth of human closeness, and in fact all the five senses. Interpersonal communication is conducted on the basis of focused and unfocused interactions. In his study of behavior in public places, Erving Goffman argues the most interpersonal communication is of an unfocused nature. It takes place whenever we observe or listen to persons with whom we are not conversing, for instance in buses, trains, lifts, or in public places like stations, bus stops, or on the streets. It is the kind of activity we indulge in when we are people watching without their being aware that we are doing so. We draw conclusions on a person's qualities, cultural and religious background, socioeconomic status, political ideologies, and other preferences without ever speaking to him or her based on their dressing, the way they move their body, the way they walk, they sit, the gestures, the loud talk, etc. Focused interaction, on the other hand, result from an actual encounter between two persons. The persons involved are fully aware that they are communicating with each other. Sitting or standing face to face each other, close or distant, they know fully well that they are exchanging both verbal and non-verbal messages, though they may not realize how these messages are being interpreted. There are three stages on interpersonal communication. The first stage is the fatigue stage. Fatigue stage is a warming up time during which ritualized greetings are exchanged. It begins with a hi or a hello, how are you, good morning, or even a simple namaste. They are only formalized manner of showing interest and attention in the person that they are communicating with. The second stage, called the personal stage, introduces a more personal element into the conversation. During this period, we generally lower our social guard a little and are prepared to take some risk in exposing ourselves and our feelings. Having moved into this personal stage, we are likely to be willing to talk about personal matters such as one's profession, the family, health problems, and the like. The intimate stage is reserved for friends and relatives, the degree of intimacy depending upon the closeness of the relationship. It is a stage where social barriers fall and we are at ease. Interpersonal communication achieves its highest form in this particular mode or stage. The next type of communication is group communication. Group communication shares all the qualities of interpersonal communication, though in a much lesser or intensity or measure. The larger the group, the less personal and intimate is the possibility of exchange. In fact, as group grows in size, communication tends to become more and more of a monologue, for participation becomes problematic. The degree of directness and intimacy therefore depends upon the size of the group, the place where it meets, and also the relationship of the members of the group to one another and to the group leader. Feedback is the key word here. While in interpersonal communication, feedback is instantaneous, it is not so in group communication, especially in large groups. What is more, it allows for instant response to feedback received. In group communication, on the other hand, feedback is more difficult to measure and respond to. It takes time before meanings are clarified and responses are assessed. The next type of communication, the last type of communication, is mass communication. Mass group communication is now being extended by the tools of mass communication, that is, books, the press, the cinema, the radio, television, video, and the internet. Mass communication is a communication at a distance with technology mediating production, transmission, and reception. The media through which messages are being transmitted include radio, television, newspapers, magazines, films, records, tape recorders, etc., and requires large organizations and electronic devices to put across the message. It is clear from this description that mass communication is a special kind of communication in which the nature of the audience and the feedback is different from that of the interpersonal communication. Whoever is a receptor of mass media content constitutes its audience. For instance, individuals reading newspapers, watching a film in the theatre, listening to the radio, or watching television are situations where audience is large, heterogeneous, and anonymous in character, and physically separated from the communicator both in terms of space and time. A large audience means that the receiver are masses of people not assembled at a single place. It may come in different sizes depending upon the media through which the message is sent. Anonymous means that the receiver of the message tends to be strangers to one another and to the source of those messages. The audience tend to be heterogeneous rather than homogeneous in the sense that the messages are sent to people in all walks of life. As compared to interpersonal communication, feedback in mass communication is slow and weak. It is not instantaneous or direct as in face-to-face exchange and is very much delayed. Feedback in mass communication is a growing response which the source gets after the considerable gap of time. It is often expressed in quantitative terms like circulation figures or of newspapers, popularity of a movie at a box office, success of a book on the basis of sales, or finding of public opinion polls on the basis of other feedback devices which are used to determine what is acceptable or unacceptable to different audiences. In all such cases, considerable time and money are required to process the feedback received from the audience. Therefore, delayed and expensive feedback is ingrained in a mass communication. With this, we come to an end to our session today. Thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Lizzie signing off.